At 87 years old, Jim Brown sat in quiet reflection. A man who once defined what it meant to be unstoppable. The crowds were gone, the echoes of helmets and cheers long faded, but his legend still hung in the air like a shadow that refused to disappear. He had been called many things over the years: a champion, a rebel, a symbol of strength, but above all, he was a standard. When he carried the ball, it was not just about yards or glory, it was about command, pride, and the unspoken code that ruled the game. For 9 years with the Cleveland Browns, every run felt like a declaration. He did not dodge defenders, he confronted them. Every hit was a test of will, every fall was an invitation to rise again. But behind the raw power and fearless confidence, there was something deeper. Jim Brown lived by principles that never bent, even when the world around him demanded compromise. He admired men who fought the same way, not for fame, but for honor. In his eyes, greatness was never about talent alone. It was about what you gave when everything hurt and the lights dimmed. Today, we step inside the quiet truth behind the myth, to uncover the 5 hidden truths that define Jim Brown's legacy, the men he respected most, and the code that made him eternal. Jim Brown was born in 1936 on Simon's Island, Georgia, a place where struggle shaped character long before dreams had names. He grew up in a world that demanded toughness, a world that taught him early that nothing worth having would ever come easy. When he arrived at Syracuse University, he didn't just join a football team. He declared war on mediocrity. Brown became a multi-sport phenomenon, dominating football, lacrosse, basketball, and track. Every sport revealed the same truth. He was built differently. His body was a weapon, his mind a compass that pointed only toward excellence. When he joined the Cleveland Browns in 1957, the league had never seen anything like him. At 6'2" and 230 pounds, he moved like a sprinter and hit like a linebacker. Every carry looked like a test that only he could pass. Defenders tried to bring him down, but he turned collisions into statements. He rose slowly after every tackle, not to show pain, but to show dominance. It became his signature, a message to anyone watching that the hit hadn't worked. Brown wasn't interested in showmanship. He didn't dance, he didn't boast. His silence was louder than celebration. For 9 straight seasons, he led the league in rushing 8 times, won 3 MVP awards, and carried Cleveland to a championship in 1964. Yet, for all the glory, statistics never defined him. He cared more about impact than numbers, about respect more than recognition. He saw football not as entertainment, but as a proving ground for courage, integrity, and endurance. In 1966, at the age of 29, while filming a movie in London, he made a decision that shocked the sports world. He retired at the peak of his power. For most men, that would have been unthinkable. For Jim Brown, it was inevitable. He refused to let anyone, not even the NFL, dictate the terms of his life. That moment revealed what separated him from the rest. He wasn't chasing immortality, he was protecting identity. After football, Brown entered Hollywood, activism, and social reform. The spotlight never left him, but neither did controversy. He became an outspoken voice for equality, often clashing with the establishment that once celebrated him. Some called him arrogant, others called him fearless. Both were right. He was a man defined by principle, unwilling to bend, even when it cost him friends, roles, or approval. To understand Jim Brown is to understand conflict, both internal and external. He admired men who faced adversity head-on, who didn't just survive the game, but elevated it. The ones who carried themselves with the same code he lived by: tough, honest, and proud. These were not rivals in his mind. They were reflections of the warrior spirit he respected most. And among all the legends he encountered, 5 stood out. 5 men who, in Jim Brown's eyes, represented the purest form of greatness. When Jim Brown first watched Gale Sayers, he didn't see competition. He saw grace. In a sport defined by violence and collision, Sayers moved like poetry. The Kansas Comet didn't run. He glided. Every cut looked effortless. Every stride carried rhythm. Brown, who had built his career on brute force and control, recognized something rare. Sayers possessed balance that turned chaos into art. Sayers entered the league in 1965, the same year Jim Brown walked away. Their careers never overlapped on the field, but their legacies brushed against each other like echoes in time. Brown saw a young man who carried the ball as if it were part of his soul. He didn't overpower defenders, he outthought them. He didn't need to crush opponents to command respect. He earned it through precision and grace. In an era when most backs tried to break tackles, Sayers simply made them miss. His moves looked rehearsed, but they weren't. They were instinct. Pure and unfiltered. Brown admired that kind of natural control, because he knew how rare it was. He once said that Gale Sayers made football look easy, and that was the hardest thing to do. Sayers's career was short. Only 5 full seasons before injuries began to steal what talent had given. But in those brief years, he burned brighter than almost anyone. 6 touchdowns in a single game, multiple All-Pro honors, and highlight reels that still feel timeless. Jim Brown understood that greatness wasn't measured by longevity. It was measured by impact. And Sayers, in that regard, stood among the immortals. To Brown, respect was sacred. It wasn't given, it was earned. Players of his generation rarely spoke words of praise. Compliments were silent, exchanged through a nod after a hit or a quiet handshake after a game. So when Jim Brown publicly acknowledged Gale Sayers, it meant something deeper. It meant recognition from a man who had set the standard. It was a torch passed in spirit, not in ceremony. Brown admired Sayers, not just for his skill, but for his character. He played without arrogance, without flash. His humility matched his brilliance. He didn't talk about greatness, he embodied it. Brown saw in Sayers a purity that the modern game often lacked. No celebrations, no self-promotion, just excellence. He was proof that the game could still produce beauty inside brutality. Both men understood the cost of playing their way. For Brown, it was defiance. For Sayers, it was fragility. Their styles were opposite, but their courage identical. Each carried his own burden with dignity, never complaining, never yielding. When Sayers's knees finally gave out, the game lost a piece of its poetry. Brown mourned that quietly, knowing what it meant to lose part of yourself to the sport you love. Years later, when asked about the players he respected most, Jim Brown's voice softened at the mention of Gale Sayers. He called him a natural, a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That respect came not from statistics or awards, but from recognition. Brown saw himself reflected in Sayers, not in power, but in purpose. In the end, Gale Sayers reminded Jim Brown of what football could be at its highest form, a dance between grace and grit, beauty and pain. The cold truth, as Brown once said, was simple. Gale Sayers made the impossible look effortless. And that, to him, was the definition of greatness. If Gale Sayers was elegance in motion, Jim Taylor was iron forged by fire. When Jim Brown thought about toughness, the kind that didn't need words, he thought about Taylor. The Green Bay Packers fullback wasn't the flashiest runner or the most celebrated star, but in the eyes of Brown, he was the embodiment of grit. Every time they met, their collisions echoed through the league. It wasn't just 2 men fighting for yards. It was 2 philosophies of football crashing head-on. Brown respected Taylor because he played the game without compromise. No excuses, no theatrics, no shortcuts. He lowered his shoulders and dared defenders to stop him. In the early 1,960 seconds, when the Browns and the Packers met, it felt like war. Brown and Taylor didn't exchange words, they exchanged punishment. They didn't need to talk about respect, because it lived in the silence between plays. Taylor's backfield was the engine of Vince Lombardi's dynasty. He was the piston that never stopped. While others looked for space, Taylor looked for contact. His runs were violent, deliberate, and relentless. He hit defenders like a hammer shaping metal, and every carry told you exactly who he was. To Brown, that kind of football was pure. It stripped the game down to its rawest truth. One man's will against another's. Statistically, Jim Brown was superior in nearly every way. More yards, more records, more acclaim. But he never looked down on Taylor. In fact, he saw him as a mirror. Both men believed that greatness wasn't about headlines. It was about consistency, pain, and endurance. Taylor represented the blue-collar heartbeat of football. The player who didn't care about cameras, only about collisions. There was a quiet honor in how Taylor carried himself. He didn't seek fame. He didn't chase legacy. He let effort speak louder than ego. After games, Brown would often find him across the field and nod. No handshake, no smile. Just a nod between warriors who had tested each other and survived. It was a small gesture, but in that era, it meant everything. Jim Brown once said that Jim Taylor's style reminded him of what football used to be. A man's game measured not by talent, but by how much punishment he could take and still get up. Taylor's body took hits that would have ended other careers, but he never quit. Every Sunday, he came back for more. Brown admired that deeply because it reflected the same code he lived by: to play hard, stand tall, and never surrender. Their rivalry never turned personal. It was mutual respect, born in pain. Each knew what it took to be great, and each recognized it in the other. They were two sides of the same coin, one polished by grace, the other shaped by grit. When Taylor finally retired, Brown described him not as an opponent, but as an equal. He said that Taylor represented everything the game should stand for. No flash, no arrogance, just hard work and pride. That, to Jim Brown, was the definition of authenticity. In a sport that rewards numbers, both men built something harder to measure. They built respect. The cold truth was that Jim Taylor didn't need to be the best. He only needed to be real. And for Jim Brown, there was nothing greater than that. When Jim Brown spoke about leadership, one name always came first: Johnny Unitas. The man with the crew cut, the black high tops, and the calmest eyes in football. He didn't look like a superstar. He looked like a man you might pass on the street, but when the whistle blew, he became the general of the gridiron. To Jim Brown, Unitas represented everything that true leadership should be: quiet, focused, and absolute. In the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, the NFL was still shaping its identity. Flash was rare, chaos was common, and toughness was a requirement. Unitas brought order to that chaos. He didn't need to shout or posture. He simply took the field, read defenses like a chess master, and executed with precision. Brown watched him from the opposite sideline and saw control in human form. He said once that Unitas never panicked, not in the rain, not under pressure, not with the season on the line. That composure made him different. For Jim Brown, respect wasn't about size or strength, it was about command. Unitas called his own plays, trusted his instincts, and earned his team's faith one throw at a time. He carried the Baltimore Colts like a man carrying a burden he welcomed. To Brown, that kind of self-reliance was sacred. It wasn't just about football, it was about character. Their matchups were legendary. Browns versus Colts. Power versus precision. Brown's force against Unitas's mind. Two leaders shaping the game from opposite ends of the field. Brown admired how Unitas faced pressure, how he turned fourth quarters into stages for greatness. He never looked rattled. He never looked afraid. Even when everything collapsed around him, he stayed calm. That calm was power. In those days, quarterbacks were hit harder, protected less, and expected to endure more. Unitas absorbed punishment without complaint. His toughness wasn't loud, it was disciplined. He played through pain because he believed leadership meant finishing what you started. Brown related to that deeply. He knew that true greatness came from consistency under fire, not from comfort or fame. Off the field, Unitas was a man of few words. He didn't chase cameras or controversy. He lived the way he played, steady, humble, and direct. That quiet dignity made a lasting impression on Brown. They didn't need to be friends to understand each other. They spoke the same language: work, respect, and pride. When Jim Brown retired, he reflected on the opponents who had truly earned his admiration. He said that few players understood what it meant to carry a team, but Johnny Unitas did. He led men with authority, not ego. He turned impossible situations into history. To Brown, that was real strength, not muscle, but will. In later years, Brown often mentioned Unitas when talking about the golden age of football. He said that men like him defined what the game used to mean before money, before showmanship, before filters. It was about heart, about taking the hit and standing tall anyway. The cold truth was that Jim Brown saw in Johnny Unitas the kind of greatness that couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. Leadership that didn't demand attention, it earned it. And when a man like Jim Brown says you earned his respect, that's not just recognition. That's immortality. When Jim Brown talked about men who treated football like war, one name came to mind: Dick Butkus. He was the middle linebacker who turned the field into his personal battleground. If Brown represented unstoppable force, then Butkus was immovable fury. They never met on the gridiron. Brown had retired the same year Butkus entered the league in 1965. But that didn't matter. Brown watched him closely, and what he saw earned his respect for life. Butkus didn't just tackle opponents, he tore through them. Every hit sounded like thunder. Every play felt like a collision between will and pain. Fans came to watch him destroy offenses, but Brown saw something different. He saw precision, he saw timing. He saw a player who played with controlled chaos. Butkus didn't hit to hurt, he hit to dominate. He read plays before they unfolded, and when he arrived, the impact was final. To Jim Brown, that kind of ferocity wasn't brutality, it was purity. It was football stripped of glamour, leaving only courage and commitment. Butkus played the game the way Brown believed it should be played: all heart, no compromise. He wasn't built like a giant, but he carried himself like one. He didn't need to speak loudly, his hits spoke for him. Every Sunday, his presence filled the stadium before his name was even called. The Chicago Bears of that era weren't always contenders, but they had something most teams didn't: fear. And that fear wore number 51. Butkus's style was violent, relentless, and yet strangely disciplined. He never took a play off. He never looked for excuses. He thrived in pain and chaos, and that's what made Brown admire him. To survive that way required more than toughness. It required obsession. Off the field, Dick Butkus was a quiet man. He didn't brag. He didn't start fights. He simply lived by the same code Jim Brown respected most: play hard, stay humble, walk away proud. He was proof that a man could be ruthless between whistles and decent after the game. That duality fascinated Brown. He once said that Butkus reminded him of what the sport was built on: honor through violence, respect through competition. Both men came from a generation that knew football's real cost. Broken ribs were patched with tape. Concussions were brushed aside as getting your bell rung. Pain was not an obstacle, it was part of the ritual. Butkus embraced that world. He didn't ask for sympathy, and he didn't give any. He stood in the middle of the field like a sentinel, daring anyone to cross. Brown, watching from a distance, recognized a kindred spirit. To Jim Brown, Dick Butkus was the perfect opponent. Even if they never shared a down, he represented the other side of the code: defense as devotion, punishment as respect. Brown believed that true greatness wasn't defined by talent alone, but by how much you were willing to sacrifice for the game. Butkus sacrificed everything: his body, his comfort, his future health, all for the purity of competition. The cold truth was that Dick Butkus didn't need to face Jim Brown to earn his place in his heart. His reputation, his presence, and his pain spoke loudly enough. For Brown, Butkus was proof that even in a brutal sport, character still mattered. Two warriors from different sides of the ball, bound by the same unbreakable law: to give everything, to take everything, and to never back down. Before Jim Brown became the symbol of power and pride, there was another man who showed him what courage truly looked like: Marion Motley. To the rest of the world, Motley was one of the first great fullbacks in professional football. To Jim Brown, he was something even greater: a mentor, a pioneer, and the man who opened the door that once seemed locked forever. When Motley joined the Cleveland Browns, in the late 1942, football was a different world. The league was not ready for integration, not ready for black players to dominate its fields. Alongside teammate Bill Willis, Marion Motley broke the color barrier in professional football long before most people were even willing to talk about equality. Every snap he took was an act of defiance. Every yard he gained was a victory over more than just defenders. Jim Brown grew up hearing about Motley's strength. The stories were passed down like legend, tales of a man who could block like a lineman and run like a locomotive. But what stayed with him wasn't just the physicality. It was the dignity. Motley carried himself with quiet pride. He didn't fight racism with anger, he fought it with excellence. He didn't demand respect, he earned it. By the time Brown arrived in Cleveland in 1957, the spirit of Marion Motley still lived in the locker room. His name was spoken with reverence. his toughness used as the standard for every young player. Brown felt that weight. He knew he was walking a path carved by someone who had endured storms far greater than his own. Motley had done more than play the game. He had changed it. Brown often said that without Marion Motley, there might never have been a Jim Brown. That statement carried truth, deeper than admiration. Motley had proven that greatness could break barriers, that talent could silence hate. He had made it possible for men like Brown to play free, to let their performance, not their color, define them. Motley was not just a player, he was a symbol. His courage turned football into a battlefield for equality. His composure turned pressure into inspiration. Even after retirement, his legacy remained the foundation for every black athlete who came after him. Jim Brown carried that influence with him his entire life. He saw in Motley the model for what a football man should be: fearless, dignified, unbreakable. Years later, when reporters asked Brown about the men who had shaped his career, his voice always softened when he mentioned Marion Motley. He called him the original. He said that Motley had taught him that power meant responsibility, and if you carried one, you had to carry the other. It wasn't about fame, it was about respect. It wasn't about headlines, it was about history. For Brown, Motley represented the intersection between sport and principle, between strength and sacrifice. Their bond was invisible but eternal, a thread connecting two generations of men who refused to bow to expectation. Brown played with the same pride Motley once carried, not as imitation, but as inheritance. The cold truth was simple. In Jim Brown's heart, Marion Motley stood above all others. Not because of numbers or trophies, but because he represented the highest version of the game. The version where courage outlasts pain, where dignity outshines fame, and where respect is not given, but earned forever. There was one man Jim Brown never faced but always respected: Walter Payton. To fans, he was sweetness, the smiling assassin who carried defenders on his back and never seemed to tire. But to Jim Brown, Payton was more than a running back. He was a craftsman, a man who carried the same fire that burned through every era of greatness. Walter Payton entered the league in 1975, long after Brown had left. Yet their names were forever linked. Payton grew up studying Jim Brown's film, mimicking his balance, his fearlessness, his refusal to surrender. Every yard Payton gained felt like a tribute to the man who came before him. But what made Brown admire him wasn't imitation, it was spirit. Payton played with dignity, with composure, and with relentless drive. When Payton broke Brown's all-time rushing record in 1984, the cameras caught Brown's reaction. There was no bitterness, no jealousy, only pride. He later said, "If someone was going to pass me, I'm glad it was Walter." That simple statement revealed everything about Brown's code. For him, greatness wasn't a competition, it was a lineage. Payton embodied the traits Brown valued most: humility, work ethic, and heart. He never celebrated excessively, never complained, never quit. He just kept running, no matter how heavy the load. Brown saw in him proof that the game could still produce real men. Men who played for honor, not applause. The cold truth was that Walter Payton didn't replace Jim Brown. He continued him. Two generations connected by one creed: give everything, fear nothing, and leave the field proud. Jim Brown's story has always been told through numbers, trophies, and headlines. But those things never defined him. What truly shaped his legacy were the principles he lived by, and the men who reflected them. Each of the 5 players he admired revealed a piece of his own identity, like fragments of a mirror showing who he was, what he valued, and what he left behind. Gale Sayers reminded him that beauty could live inside violence. The way Sayers moved, light on his feet, and fearless in his intent, reminded Brown that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knew his craft so well that he didn't need to prove anything. In Sayers, Brown saw the artist he could never be, the one who turned chaos into grace. Jim Taylor brought him back to the raw edge of the game. Their collisions were battles of endurance, neither man giving an inch. Taylor represented the working-class heart of football, the part of the sport built on pain, discipline, and repetition. Brown saw in him a mirror of his own soul, forged by contact, hardened by respect. Johnny Unitas stood as the architect of calm. Where others lost control, Unitas thrived. He commanded chaos without fear. just focus. For Brown, Unitas embodied leadership in its purest form. He didn't dominate with his body, but with his mind. He was proof that strength wasn't always about impact. Sometimes it was about control, the ability to keep steady when the world fell apart. Dick Butkus represented the other side of the coin, the chaos, the fury, the hunger that made football feel like survival. Brown admired that ferocity because it came from love, not hate. Butkus didn't destroy for attention. He destroyed for purpose. Every hit carried respect. Every tackle carried commitment. Brown understood that kind of devotion. He had lived it himself. And then there was Marion Motley, the man who had opened the door for all of them. Motley wasn't just a football player. He was a movement in cleats. He taught Brown that courage wasn't about playing through pain. It was about standing tall in a world that wanted to push you down. Motley was the foundation, the beginning of the story. And Brown never forgot it. These 5 names were not random choices. They were a reflection of Jim Brown's code. Grace, grit, leadership, fury, courage. Together, they painted the full picture of what football meant to him. A test of character disguised as a game. For Brown, the sport wasn't about entertainment or fame. It was about manhood, about proving something to yourself when no one else believed. Beyond the field, Jim Brown carried those lessons into every chapter of his life. In Hollywood, he played roles that broke stereotypes and challenged expectations. In activism, he spoke for justice, with the same conviction he once used to break tackles. In private, he wrestled with his flaws, knowing that greatness came with a price. The same fire that drove him to conquer could also burn too hot to control. Yet even in controversy, his influence never faded. When people spoke of Jim Brown, they spoke of intensity. But those who truly knew him spoke of consistency. He didn't live to be liked. He lived to be real. That authenticity, raw and often uncomfortable, became his greatest legacy. He showed that power without principle meant nothing, and principle without courage meant even less. When he died in 2023 at 87, the game paused. Players, coaches, and fans across generations reflected on the standard he left behind. The records were impressive, but the respect was eternal. Jim Brown had built something that outlived statistics. He built a code, one that still echoes through locker rooms and highlight reels today. The cold truth was that Jim Brown's greatness wasn't measured in touchdowns or MVP awards. It was measured in how deeply he impacted others, how he inspired men to play harder, stand taller, and live with conviction. His legacy wasn't about football, it was about integrity, strength, and the belief that respect must always be earned, never given. In the end, Jim Brown wasn't just part of football history. He was the heartbeat of what made it matter. Beyond trophies and fame, his story became the definition of timeless. Because legends fade, but codes, once written in blood, never die. Jim Brown's story reminds us that greatness is never simple. It is not just about talent, speed, or fame. It is about the code that drives a man to give everything when no one is watching. His life was a reminder that the game of football, at its core, has always been about respect, about what you stand for when the whistle blows and the world grows quiet. Each of the men he admired carried a part of that truth. Gale Sayers with his grace, Jim Taylor with his grit, Johnny Unitas with his calm, Dick Butkus with his fury, Marion Motley with his courage. Together, they formed a map of what real football men are made of, not statistics, but standards. And through it all, Jim Brown stood at the center, the one who defined the measure of respect itself. So as you watch these stories unfold, ask yourself one question. What does greatness really mean? Is it numbers, records, or the will to rise every time you fall? Jim Brown's life had one answer. Greatness is not what the game gives you. It is what you give back to the game. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden truths, subscribe to NFL Hidden Truths for more untold stories from football's golden age. Comment below and tell us which truth surprised you the most, or which rivalry defined your generation. Because the legends may be gone, but their lessons remain, echoing through every hit, every yard, and every name we still remember. In the end, Jim Brown's story was not about football. It was about respect, the kind that lasts forever.